Well, welcome back to part two of keeping, finding, discovering joy in marriage and ministry. We were just having a talk offline about that elusive word joy. What does it mean versus happy or blessed? And is it something you find, discover, cultivate, byproduct? And so we're going to talk a little bit about that today, but I'm pleased to welcome back Neal and Christina Davidson. They have, as we talked about last time, have been in ministry and have been married for 41 years. So a lot of collective experience. And my personal relationship, I see a lot of wisdom and understanding that has grown over the years, and they've invested themselves in one another, their family. They've invested in the church, and God has blessed their ministry in many, many ways. So last week we talked a bit about how to overcome the difficulties, the stresses, the strains of marriage. And they told us their story. Our approach here is a little more narrative than just them giving a talk on marriage, but out of the narrative, out of the story of their life, we're discovering principles and some things are going to be descriptive of their unique situation. But some things are going to be prescriptive that they talk about principles from the Bible, and we're going to learn a lot and be encouraged, I think, and I think we're going to be challenged as well. So welcome back, Neal and Christina. It's good to see you both. You are sitting in different spots. This
Just trying to throw you off balance, Robbie. That's all.
it's not hard. It's not hard.
Keep you on your toes.
Well, thank you so much. So, if you want to just do a really quick recap, the first part, and of course, both of these, part one and part two, will be archived, so you can watch them together. We just decided to not overwhelm you with an hour and a half, but to have two 45 to 55 minute sections. So,
Well, it's good to be back. And as you mentioned earlier, Christina and I actually have been in ministry together um, for all but 2 months of our 41 years of marriage. We got married in July of 1984, and I went on a church staff in August, just a few weeks later. Literally right at the end of our honeymoon, and then about a month later, the same church hired her to be the organist for the church. So we've been in ministry together literally all of our married life, and that's through raising two boys and planting two churches and serving with a denomination in between, and her being a worship leader at another church here in the region, and just a lot of different things that have gone on with that. And first of all, we're just having a conversation about marriage. It's not like we're trying to teach a conference, and we've done that, enjoy doing that, and there's a lot of things you need to lay out. But this is just much more about some of the skill sets, mindsets, or whatever you have to in order to be able to continue to really thrive in ministry as well as thrive in marriage, and make ministry something that adds to your marriage and rather than taking away from it. And
That your marriage impacts and shapes your ministry also.
yeah, well, I mean, both of them are a part of your identity you can't get away from. So I mean, and so
hard as you try.
both of those are somehow or another supposed to bring glory to God. And
yes,
you were asking, what does it really mean, to have joy in marriage? And
yeah,
and I think in some ways it's and same with joy in ministry. I look at it and again, very hard to define, kind of a lot of nuances and et cetera to it. But to me, a lot of it is that it fuels you. It continues to energize you, move you forward, move you closer. It's fulfilling and rewarding and all those kinds of wonderful things that go with it. And, so.
that there's just the prospect of fruit, of hope that, things are good, that you just feel like God is using you, but God's blessing you too, even through very difficult times or even unexpected things and uncertainties.
And another way to put it, and this is very, very practical terms, when you keep your joy in marriage, it means that when you finally face the prospect of being empty nesters, you're looking forward to it rather than dreading it. Do you know what I mean? You don't have to have
just curb your enthusiasm a little bit.
Yeah.
Until the door's shut, and then
miss them, but we're
I told my
pretty
boys
nice, yeah.
I told my boys all the time, I'm raising you to grow up, move out and stay out. And for the most part, they've done that. So it's been really good. So, so today, there are a lot of stresses and strains in marriage and in ministry that you're not going to be able to avoid. And so we talked about some of that.
Predict.
Yeah, some of that we talked about last time, to use Jesus as, the rain's going to fall, the wind's going to blow, the river's going to rise. And so how do you weather some of those storms? And we try to talk about some things that we learned about last time. But there are a lot of things that we can do to kind of invest in our marriages as you're going along.
Yeah.
That not only allow you to survive the stresses and the strains, but it also are things that you can build it so it actually grows over time, right? So and so we want to talk about some of those things today. And I want to start with a statement that might not seem to relate, might not make a lot of sense in this, but I think it's been really powerful for a way we have done ministry in a way, our marriage, and it's really been a gift to our marriage. When I was getting ordained back in 1985, I was down in Texas, and our home church was here in New England at First Baptist Sudbury, and the pastor there sent me a note in the mail, and he actually drawn his hand on a piece of paper, to lay on kind of idea.
You still
But no, I don't. So that was David Dean. Some guys would remember that name, and and David put in a note to me, and I don't have the note anymore either. But the one thing I remember his note, he said, is don't take yourself too seriously. And and what he really meant by that was, we could have this complex as ministers, especially as solo pastors, that it is our sole responsibility to make the church grow, right? So we just pile on this pressure that we have to do everything and be everything and be at everything and et cetera. And and listen, I know there's guys maybe going to listen to this that so, well, I'm the only guy. So listen, we when I was planting the church in Hanover, the office was in our house for 3 years. We had no place to go, right? I mean, and in fact, when the first boy was born, I had to move to the back porch, so we had to enclose it. So and I had, and then when we started the church here in Hanover, I mean, everything that the church had was in our house or in the trailer in our driveway. Yeah. And we used to have rehearsals in our living room. The boys and I would seclude ourselves in the basement, and they'd be wailing away in the drums and the guitars and everything else in our living room. And we don't have a big house, so we understand that there's a lot that you have to be engaged in. But when we have this mentality that almost like almost like a Jesus complex, right? That we're the one who has to make all this happen. I think that's detrimental for your marriage. And the reason I say that, I'm going to let Christina pipe in here in a minute, but when God's supposed to be our number one priority, right? If you don't hate your father and your mother, your wife, your brothers and sisters, whatever, you can't be my disciple. If you have that kind of that perspective that I'm responsible for everything, I've got to do everything, I have to be at everything, and et cetera, you're going to be making all kinds of priority choices, and what's going to lose out is your marriage and your family.
And who can survive under the weight of that? That's just so unrealistic. And maybe the Bible puts it another way: don't think too highly of yourself, and perhaps
an estimate of yourself, I think.
That I have. This is my role. My calling includes being everything to everybody. And there's just no way, and it's almost like a false sense of pride that's masked in humility, but it's just
so. Let me give you a picture of this in operation, right? So we've been here in Central Mass now for 3 decades. We've lived in our house in Sterling for 31 years now, and so not too long ago, there was an experience. I got a call from one of our families, said, "Hey, there's a Red Sox game on Sunday at 1:00, and we can't go. We have 4 tickets. Do you know somebody who would want them?" And so I called up a fellow pastor.
We couldn't go. We would have loved to have gone. That was very generous.
So I reached out to another pastor in our region, small church, not a lot of resources, struggling to get by, could really use some good moments. And so I called them and I said, hey, I got these 4 tickets. Do you want to take your family and go to the game? And their service was at 10 o'clock. So,
Could have made a 1 o'clock.
they easily could have made a 1 o'clock
Yeah.
start. And they turned the tickets down because I guess there were 3 older women in the church that he picked up every Sunday and dropped off every Sunday. And he had been doing that for years, and he didn't have anybody else to do that. And
One
and so
Sunday could
so
change those plans or ask someone else.
or just to say, hey, I'm not going to be able to do that this week. Or I'll call you an Uber and get you home, or whatever. But it was this idea that I have to do everything, and what really lost out was some time, really precious time with his
Forfeited
family.
memories it could have made,
And
Resigning himself to that there's not another option.
right.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
again, if it had been somebody he had been praying for 10 years to come to a service and hear the gospel, that might have been one thing. But if these were diehards in the church who had been there for decades, and if they missed the Sunday, it wasn't going to be the
And
world.
this is another aspect of the conversation that Neal and I've had in a similar way, but I have often felt a lot of the shoulds in ministry. I should do this, and hurting people abound, sick, need abounds, those kinds of things. And I've always grappled with, and probably a lot of this is from my people pleasing tendencies, which are not healthy, that I need to do this and I need to do that. And I found myself even like about 3 weeks ago, I could think on one day, I just felt the weight of, there were like 4 women who I knew had immediate need. And but I just had to say, Lord, I know you've called me to this today, and this is all I can do. And Neal will often say, Christina, you live out of guilt too much. And then my retort is often, well, you could use a little more guilt in your life than, but
Yes, it is.
but really, this came to a head in 2019. We had the privilege of taking a 3 month, it was about 3 month sabbatical, and it was life-giving. And one of the things that I did, particularly during that time, was I went to go see a Christian counselor, and it was a woman in Laconia. Listeners, if you're around that region, I have a great name for you. But I just thought to myself, I've never had like an emotional checkup, like check-in, like I go for my physical every year or whatever to my doctor. Why wouldn't I explore this? And so she was wonderful and really began to uncover some of these shoulds that I was operating out of in ministry. And it again is kind of a false pride thing. I need to serve and fix all these people and do all these things for these people. But I think in every season, particularly in these later years for us in ministry, is that we need to embrace in Ephesians 4 that Paul calls the leaders of the church, pastors, teachers, apostles, or whoever's those shepherding people, to equip the saints for the work of ministry and not always be doing the work myself or ourselves. And we're not doing the body any good or any service by saying, oh, well, I'll do that.
Yeah.
No, it's okay. I'll do, but if we're enlisting people to go with us, so we're making people known of a need. I can't visit this person today, and can you take them a meal maybe next week? Or can you just engaging people and so for them to use their gifts as God has called them to. And I think that's a much more healthy place to serve at.
Yeah. So, another way to kind of, I think it's really important for your marriage for you to set good boundaries for your ministry, and, I think, I think of it somewhat like as a river, right? I mean, you can have a river that's beautiful and powerful and do a lot of things, but if it floods the banks, it destroys everything. And so you just have to have good boundaries in there. And we just really have to work at that pretty hard. And one of the things that, so when I was down at the church in Hanover, this is back in the late 1980s, and, we had our first child. And I remember we just had a couple of 3 deacons at that point. The church was 50 people and that kind of thing. And and I remember saying to the deacons, I said, I'm trying to figure this out, in terms of what's the right flow. And after a brief conversation, they said, we don't want you out except for under extraordinary circumstances. We don't want you out more than 2 nights a week on ministry stuff.
So grateful for that.
Outside of Sunday night, we were still doing Sunday night services then. Outside of Sunday night, when it came to Monday through Saturday, they didn't want me out more than 2 nights a week. And I was really grateful for that because as a young guy, a young pastor, I was in my 20s. We can, we're out 3, 4, 5 nights a week. We feel like we have to visit everybody, do everything, be at every Bible study, lead every Bible study, all that kind of stuff. And it was helpful. And we've done that off and on. I mean, we here at Hope Chapel, there were times, we used to do men's breakfasts almost every month. And, but there would be times like, all right, I had a couple of weddings and I had or a funeral, or I had, a denominational event or whatever I went to on a Saturday, and I just wouldn't come. I mean,
Or we had family that we had plans to spend time with, and we
right.
just did that.
So,
And, yeah.
so some of that is not taking yourself too seriously, not developing this complex, if you will, which just suffocates all the other priorities in your marriage, in your life, including your marriage.
And really, I'll just close this section
right.
with this one comment, is that church ministry and leadership is so immersive in nature anyway, but we've got to, in terms of marriage, cultivate some kind of life outside of church. like said, it's our identity, and one kind of impacts and shapes the other, but we've got to do something that's not church related, and being on staff together, it is an added challenge, because there's a lot of off hours calls and conversations, and so we've literally had to say, hey, this is we're out to dinner right now. Let's just not talk about this. Sorry.
Right.
I mean, that seems obvious, but you really have to draw those riverbanks.
Or when you're out for a walk or whatever.
That imagery.
So here's a next one, and this is one definitely we're looking back at and say, boy, we're just grateful that instinctively we did this. But in ministry, I mean, you clearly deal with some marriages that are in trouble. That people come to you, their marriages are not healthy, they're really struggling, and et cetera. And especially as a number of marriages that you're serving get larger, and there's more and more of those, you're more likely to see that. So over the years, all of my years of ministry, and I've seen this in pastors' lives and in a regular married life, is it's the marriages that have the hardest time of really kind of, it's often that they find themselves at a breaking point, and they're really not sure they want to be married. The ones that's harder to recover from that are the ones who suffer from, and I'm going to use an interesting, at least to me, imagery here. They're carrying a backpack full of pebbles as opposed to trying to carry one big boulder. We had a couple of scenarios,
but the weight is overwhelming.
Yeah. So what I mean by
cumulative weight.
Sometimes, sometimes you deal with marriage where there's been infidelity or some other kind of major breach of trust, and actually sometimes it's easier to forgive that and heal from that and move forward than just having weekly, all kinds of little disagreements, misunderstandings, miscommunications, not being on the same page, whatever. And it just chips away at trust, and then all of a sudden they find themselves to the point where they don't trust their spouse anymore with their well-being, and it's really hard to be one with somebody you don't trust. And those pebbles comes in all kinds of little fashions, whether it's forgetting to pick up the milk on your way home, or just chronically being late after you've said, I won't do that. Or some of the scenarios we dealt with, were, and I don't want to be very specific because I don't want to call anybody out, but just scenarios where one spouse says, all right, I'll take over paying the bills and take care of it, and then they're just late on all kinds of payments, and they say they forget to put things on their calendars and don't protect the time and can't get to family events, and just all this little stuff just chips away over and over again, and before you know it, they're carrying this backpack that's got 500 pounds of pebbles in it, and and it's a whole lot harder to go through and try to forgive for every single little pebble than it is for one big boulder. You know what I mean?
Uh,
And so I think the couple of thoughts, and I'm Christina's going to expand on this, but a couple of thoughts that really stand out to me that's so important for thriving in ministry and in marriage, and having ministry really add to your marriage, and vice versa, is one, you really need to focus on communication. And you need to, you don't assume that it's taken place, but make sure that you've really heard each other, and you resolve stuff in the short run.
Yeah.
And the other thing that's really just stood out to me is just how important trust is. And trust isn't just limited to the fact that Christina is the only one that I am physically intimate with. It goes with it. That trustworthiness goes to how I treat her family, how I treat my family, how I treat the boys, how I talk about parishioners, to the way that I deal with
How you
people
speak with
across, all that
integrity,
kind of stuff
and
is,
recalling events in ways that are
and
true and honest.
and
Yeah.
just and if there's something, it may not be hugely important, but if it's significant enough that it's going to bother them or you, make sure you actually come up with a common decision, not just.
Otherwise, you have another pebble to add to
That's
the.
right. And we've dealt with numbers of marriages over the years where it's just the little things that have added up. They couldn't agree on what to do with the kids, or how to do
Oh,
this or do that,
oh,
or what they were going to spend money on, et cetera. And when they were going to get in, and there's all this stuff that goes on, and after a while they don't really trust one another anymore, and it just eats away at oneness. So you just got to avoid the pebbles. You got to have the time regularly to settle the things that are going to have an impact, even if they're not life-changing decisions. You still have to be on the same page.
and I don't know if I assume this is for a guy too, but um, one of the commonalities just in there's been 4 marriages in the last 3 months that Neal and I have been very closely connected to and talking with, and talking separately, individually to each, the woman or the man. But what one of the commonalities is that there is just this despair that they do not have any hope or
Hmm.
inkling of hope, or the certainty that the spouse, the other person, can change. Now, that's not to say that um, that person doesn't need changing too, but there's this sense like, he's never going to change. She's never going to meet this need. She's never, I just, there's this lack of hope. And that's really, really hard to come back from.
Yeah.
It's like it requires a resurrection of there's just a deadness toward that other person. And it's interesting. I want to use an analogy, but first, a very practical example, not only of communication, but of trust, is the use of our phones. And I'll tell you, even from something very, very um, um, like small or incidental, like I'll be, we need to choose when we want to like do a deep dive in a conversation. But if oftentimes I'll be talking to Neal, and not often, but there's been a few times. I'm sorry, and I'll say, "Did you hear me? Are you can I?" And I'll just wait, and I'm like, I'll talk to you later about. No, 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 I can hear you. And what bugs me is he really can multitask so well that he can hear me and repeat exactly back with emotion what I've told him. But the other thing is, so just eye contact while we're explaining something, or even just a very small thing about, I need to do this after work today, or pick this up, or just that there's this connection that I'm listening to you, what you're saying is valuable and worthwhile. But the other thing is, even, sometimes because the load can be so heavy, that sometimes you just want to veg. And so, but scrolling, on social media, and just like and also to know that we're doing good things with our phones
Yeah.
individually, and in the secret, or apart from one another, even when we're together. And so I have that confidence that, anyway, you
Yeah.
can take that all other lengths,
You,
but
you know, so just a little symptom, and I want to move on to the next one. So, and this is, I don't even, she probably doesn't even know this, but
uh-oh.
so Christina
Oh,
Christina teaches piano lessons out of our home. And she used to do it 4 afternoons a week. Now she's down to 3 afternoons a week. And I can remember years ago her just saying, it's so it's so hard to keep the house clean and decluttered because there's people coming in every afternoon. You got to have it set up. And it was certainly challenging when the boys were at home. But now one of the things I discipline myself to do is every morning before I leave, on the days that she's teaching piano lessons, I make sure my slippers get in the bedroom. Now they may just get thrown in the door, but I get, I hang my jackets up, I get the stuff, so I do my part to keep my stuff out of the way, just because that's, a part of the way you say that you can trust me. And there's all kinds of little pebbles that I'm going to share this imagery, and it's not original with me, and then I want to move on to our next point. But when I think about marriage, the love we have with one another is a lot like the engine, right? We could have a big 8.1 diesel, a lot of power to go a long way, and then communication's a lot like the steering wheel, but trust is like the oil in the engine, right? And the grease that's in the joints. And if you don't have trust, it makes every moving part that much harder. And
Until
so,
it grinds to a halt.
right. And
It burns out.
or it creates extra heat before it seizes.
Yes, that's
And
right.
some of us are living with that. And so those trust points are really huge. Um,
Before you
and,
go
and
to the next point, can I?
yeah,
I think some couples, for whatever reason, and there's probably a myriad of reasons,
yeah,
wait until it's too late
Yeah.
to help.
yeah,
And they've already kind of written scripts for every argument. So it's almost like you can go to the last page because we know we're going to both storm off. And then sometimes having another person in the room can help diffuse some of that. But
yeah.
how, when you're working with families and couples, um, what are some things that you look for, and what do you try to communicate to people in terms of, hey, that's a red flag. Maybe you just need to get a tune up, or maybe you just need to get the oil checked, or maybe you need to take it in and it's going to be a major overhaul.
Yeah.
Well, it's a lot of things, and one imagery that does come to mind that maybe is a barometer for
Mm.
marriage health or ministry health is, but like this time of year right now, this month is very, very difficult. It's dark, it's cold, it's rainy, and if you were to take, particularly where you live, Robbie, and we've just now seen some little buds, but if you were to take a snapshot, say of mid-March and then compare it to a snapshot of mid to late November, things would look very similar. Dead leaves, empty
Mhm.
branches, cold gray sky. But if you to ask yourself, where are we now in our marriage? Are we trending toward death, toward winter? Are we trending toward spring, toward hopefulness? And I think some of the characteristics or activities or qualities that you might see where, well, is there is there affection?
Yeah.
Is there playfulness and laughter? Is there
Yeah.
fun times that we're planning or that kind of things? Is there sex? Is there lovemaking? Is there an appreciation even that's expressed? So maybe those kinds of,
Yeah.
I don't know. I like that. I'm
Yeah.
a real big word picture person, so that's a
So,
that's a great imagery
and this whole question is a great segue to what we want to talk about next. But Robbie, I take a little bit of a different approach. I like to rock people back on their heels in those moments. So, because like I can remember talking to a guy, and his wife was just very frustrated that he just spent so much time playing video games, and the grass is 18 inches long, and this and that kind of stuff.
They
And
were
I,
young.
and I said to both of them, I said, let's get our cards on the table to start. So tell me what you're unwilling to change in order to have the marriage that you want to have. So that's where we started. I
Yeah,
said, tell me what you're unwilling to change, what you're unwilling to give up
that's a good
in order to
question.
have the marriage that you want to have. And so obviously it's a very leading question because the guy's not going to say, well, I'm not giving up my video games. You know what I'm saying? But it also helps them put things in perspective.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think some ways we need to make sure that we do not undervalue our marriages,
Mhm.
and in terms of ministry. And really the next thing we really wanted to say is that, you just, in order for your marriage to be something that continues to bring spring into your life, bring, this new life, be energizing, fulfilling, to
I
bring joy.
like the artistic bent
There we
there.
go.
Yeah.
I'm trying to
He's very
build off that. There
artistic,
we
yeah.
go. Um, is that you really have to invest the time to make sure that you stay we instead of reverting back to me, and
Yeah.
marriage is an absolutely unique relationship.
Yeah,
It is,
one we versus two me's.
right. I mean,
Us,
it is the only relationship, human relationship, where God asks us to change our identity in order for us to fulfill that relationship. That for this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and cling to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh, right? We move from being me to us, from I to we, right? And in order to stay there, you have to keep working at it, and so you just have to make sure that you spend the time to make sure that you are continuing to function as we and not just revert back into me. I have my schedule, you have your schedule. We do, those kinds of back and forth things. I mean, it's one of the reasons why I tell a lot of couples that unless there is a really valid reason, they shouldn't have separate bank accounts. Some couples do, but and it works for them. But by and large, it's not my money and their money. It's our money, right? And it's our time. It's our future. It's our, week. It's all those kinds of things together. And so for us, we've been fortunate, and some pastors really have to work at this, but we always had family that was somewhat accessible to take kids off of our hands for a night or two, or those kinds of things. And
We
and
know
uh,
not everybody has that,
and
but
and and I'm sure there's ways to that there's that if you work at it, you can find those partnerships, but you need date times. You need nights away. Like my birthday falls in January and our anniversary is in July. And we would always go away on my birthday and on our
what
anniversary.
about my birthday?
Well, yours was right next to our anniversary in June and July, right? So, we would go away so about every 6 months we were getting away for a night or two
Yeah,
just to be us, and we would fork the kids off on her parents or my parents or one of our siblings or whatever. And we would invest time in us. We got in the habit by the time we got to our 10th anniversary that we would plan a trip. Our first trip on our 10th anniversary went to San Francisco, and we saved up points and this and that or whatever. The whole trip didn't cost us a whole lot of money, but
yeah.
we were gone for like 6, 7 days. And then for our, our 15th, I think we went to England and then to
Denmark,
Paris. And
yeah.
then our 20th, we went to my sister's,
Okay.
my brother-in-law's
Denmark,
from
yeah.
Denmark. And so we went to
Anyway,
Copenhagen
yeah.
and then into Paris. And then for our 30th, believe it or not, we spent 26 days in Europe. We were shooting for 30 days. But, again, we're just blessed to be in that
Very
position. We could
unique,
do
but
that.
yeah,
But,
yeah.
there's ways, and you just have to do that. You need to invest the time to make sure that you're still one, right? And a part of that is having a healthy sex life. I mean, that's different for lots of couples, and it and there could be lots of issues that go with that, right? A lot of young couples that come in, there's baggage from pornography and abuse and body image issues and all those kinds of things. And we obviously don't have all the answers to that today, in terms
Yeah.
of this discussion, but there's a way in which being physically intimate is to be a celebration of that oneness, and there's a way in which that needs to be good for both couples. I tell young couples all the time that I'm doing pre-marriage counseling with, the most exclusive commitment you make to one another is with your bodies, right? You can go to a show with somebody else, you can go shopping with somebody else,
Well,
you
your
can play
minds too,
golf
I would
or
say,
whatever,
but
but
yeah,
but but
yeah.
but you can even share your mind with other people, but physically, I made a commitment that the only person in the world that I'm going to express my sexuality to is her. And if she's not receiving that in a way where I can trust her, that breaks down oneness. And that goes true
Or
vice
vice
versa.
versa, yeah.
Vice versa.
Mhm.
And so there's a way in which you have to really work this out mutually. But if when you do that, it really is something that keeps the gas tank full. Do you
You
know what I
know,
mean?
and it is important, and just to realize too that and one thing we've tried to do is be realistic and think about how we can be lovers at every season of life. And things are a lot different now, just in terms of our life together, even, but our age and our physically, our bodies from when we were 21, when I was 21 and we first got married, right? I mean, that's just, and now I'm 41. Now I'm 61. Wait a minute.
I was
Yeah.
doing the math, and I was just gonna go
Child
with it.
bride.
1 year, I didn't grow at all, but and yeah, we don't want to be simplistic about it, but I will say that there's a heaviness in that area of marriage and of intimacy that is weighing on marriages and ministry marriages. And I think that I don't know, there's this underlying that we've kind of had conversations about this underlying vibe that um because we don't talk about it very much, there's a perceived shame about sex, especially sex before marriage. There's too much suffering and silence, really, not only say for women, but for men, and just that they feel like, because we're in ministry, we should have our marriage should have it all together, and there's just no way. And we need to get over the stigma of reaching out for help,
That's
and it needs to be confidential and discreet. But there's times in our seasons you need a third party person to process this with a language, or you do a book or
yeah.
video series, something where you're just not feeling like so alone and discouraged by this area of your ministry. And it's so easy, particularly for us as I've had to fight against this a lot, and both of us really have, being in staff together, that our marriage doesn't default to sort of this utilitarian, planning organizational structure, but that we're not just partners, but we're lovers at every stage. Maybe I already said that, but
Yeah,
just
yeah, yeah.
it's just so finding out how to and discovering how to do that apart from church life, but just
Yeah.
in every
And
season
that
of
and
life.
that and
And
that's
so
and that goes
it's
back to some of the
critical.
little pebble pieces, right? There are times in staff, that I have to veto ideas, just say, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to do X. And especially since I stand between our elders and our staff, and we have 6 staff members, and so there's just and so sometimes that can get carried over to home, and I have to learn not to respond to her differently than I do to the rest of the staff, and vice versa, all that kind of good stuff.
Same
But
here. Yep.
some of the adjustment, I think about it, over the years. I mean, now usually now our intimacy occurs earlier in the day than it used to. You crawl into bed at 9:30, 10 o'clock at night, you're
Really?
going to
No.
sleep. Yeah, anyway, so
Yeah. Yeah.
probably too much revelation right there.
One thing that I've reflected on a lot over the past few years, especially as I look back at different seasons of life and have some living that's happened and life that's happened, it's becoming one of the phrases, the whole me or me to we.
Yeah,
That's true in every situation, and that's true in every one of these areas
yeah,
because you're sort of God's word is living, it's applicable, it's true. But what that passage maybe communicated to my 20-year-old self
Right.
as a 67-year-old, same truth.
yeah,
But it's speaking to, I'm very different than I was 20 years when I was 20 years old.
sure.
But in all these arenas, the me we thing happens because sometimes you get into your 40s or 50s and they statistics say that there's a big dip in marital satisfaction during the kid years and then it can come way back up. But sometimes you develop patterns of me in the we, not
Yeah,
just, you like to golf, so you get to golf on a Friday, but just more deeper than that.
yeah,
And that's a constant kind of the barometer, Christina, that you talked about. How's our me we?
And so, a lot of this stuff comes together in the next little point I want to make, and then we can kind of move into some closing comments. But when when you're when you're setting appropriate boundaries and making sure that the other commitments in your life isn't suffocating your commitment to one another, and you're giving that priority, and you really are watching the pebbles that are going in, right? And you're
Mm.
investing in staying we instead of becoming me again, and you're growing all those kinds of things. You're actually in a place where you can release each other. You don't have to grab onto it. Christina probably doesn't remember this, but back when we were dating in high school, you know, um, I have sisters that are about her age, and so she came with the family up to a cabin that we had, and
Yeah.
my dad made it very clear to me, your job is to work, right, this weekend, and
I was a
because
distraction.
we were doing roofs, and so and I was 16 years old, 17 years old, whatever it was, and
So mature.
I can remember, yeah, I can remember, just wanting to keep an eye on everything that she was doing. And I remember my dad saying to me, he said, you keep that up, you're going to suffocate her and you're going to drive her away.
Wow, that was
And
respectful of your dad. That's
yeah, because he was an old farm boy, he really wasn't the emotional type very much. And but so to get to a place where it's easy to say, you know what, go out and have dinner with your girlfriends, or go to one of your student school plays on a Sunday afternoon, or do whatever, or not have to feel guilty that you went to the golf course and played, for a couple of hours, and you came home an hour later than you normally would, and those kinds of things. And so you're able to release each other, and that just keeps you growing, so there's more of you to put back into we, and to keep that we going. But the last thing I really want to say is, it is
Well, and I
so
just want to
okay.
affirm that too, because there's been so many times where he said, why don't you go to that conference, or why don't you, yeah, sign up for that subscription, or make the investment, or and just trying to encourage me to find ways to grow personally as a worship ministry leader, just as a child of God, and just feeling, and even just encouraging, just to invest in myself, to be
Yeah.
just to be a better leader. And I've really appreciated that we've done this in parallel, but also
Yeah. So
separately, but encouraging each other along
the
the
la
way.
the last thing that we really want to say is it is so easy at times, especially after 40 years, just to settle for what you have.
Very
And
easy.
I think one of the things that just by our natures or whatever, we've just always set the bar high and kept going to make it better. And
The
that's
one
that.
better than if it's not broke, don't
Yeah,
Yeah.
don't fix it, right?
Yeah, just let it be.
It was interesting. A couple of years ago, we had Dr. Malcolm Yarnell come and do a conference for us here, and some of our and Christina was roommates with his wife, and he's the research. He's a
Dean of
yeah,
research. Yeah.
he's a systematic theology resident at Southwestern Seminary. Really good guy, and I remember talking to him, and he says, there's only a few primary covenants that you see in the scriptures, right? And marriage is one of those. So marriage is one of those primary covenants, and obviously there's the Abrahamic covenant and those kinds of things. And so, but one of the, and then there's the salvation covenant, if you will, right? And but you know, we often don't think about our marriages as being a model of God, right? We
Mm.
think about, all right, what kind of pastor do they see? And we really need to set this bar really high to say, that one of the biggest gifts as pastors we can give to those around us is to have a thriving, joyful, fulfilling
Yeah.
marriage.
Yeah.
And in some ways, all this discussion of what does headship really mean or whatever, I don't have all the answers to that, but one of the things I will say is that means I get to go first. I mean, I get to go first in blessing her, equipping her, empowering her, asking for forgiveness, I get to go first and change all those kinds of things. And, I get to take the initiative to get that to the next level.
And I'd like to say too, I think the word submission gets a real bad rap. And maybe 4 or 5 years ago, we were working with a couple to develop their marriage vows, and they did not want the word submission. They had friends there. This is like old-fashioned. This is oppressive. But I'd really like to say, on the heels of what he's saying, and it was just really a thought I had maybe a year ago, that it's really, really beautiful to submit to each other. In the beginning of that passage, actually, is at the end of chapter 4, end of chapter 5,
yeah.
that
Submit to one
Paul says
another
mutually submit to one another
out of reverence for
out
Christ.
of reverence
Yeah.
for Christ.
Yeah.
And then he begins to talk about wives and
Yeah.
husbands. And so it's a really good thing that helps you when you're deferring yourself to the other person. There's growth and beauty there. And
So,
yeah.
just a couple of closing thoughts with this
Wait,
time.
so I just want one more thing too. One thing you said, are you still talking about are you going on for that point?
No, I'm staying on this point, but go ahead.
Well,
Yep.
there have been times too, even just like in your family, I think it's healthy to demonstrate appropriate affection in front of your children. And growing up in the home and things. And so even in the church building, or we haven't seen each other all day, or maybe, several hours, or say goodbye with a kiss or something, or and Neal will say, well, not in front of the children, like, yes, in front of the children. This is good that they're seeing that we love each other.
So, I've had the privilege of going to Rwanda for a number of years, and it was really shocking to me when I first got there. I asked the guys the first year I was there. I said, have any of you ever seen any real miracles? And so this one guy stood up and he talked about that his young child, I think it was like an infant crawling, got hit with a door in the head and was really kind of, I think had a concussion and was really suffering from it and whatnot. And so he was talking about running to the local clinic, and they said, there's nothing we can do for you. Your child's going to die. So he got a bus and took it to a hospital a long way away and that kind of thing. And then, and in the midst of this whole conversation, he indicated that he had beat his wife for letting the child get hurt. And I said, whoa, back up here, and I guess that wasn't, it's not uncommon. It's not highly common, but it's not uncommon either.
Less common.
And so we held 2 or 3 marriage conferences with the pastors and their wives in Rwanda. And it's really quite a hoot to get them all together. Some of the ladies had never been to a place where they'd seen a paved road before. It was really, really quite interesting to get them all together. And, what I said to the pastors was, I said, when you read Ephesians, one of the things that you should be able to say to somebody you're trying to lead to Christ, you're trying to lead to faith, to say, you look at the way that I treat my wife, and that's symptomatic of the way that Christ is going to treat you.
Oh boy.
Right? It's a model, right? And we are to love our wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. So, and there's ways I think that as pastors, we need to understand that our marriages are a model. And so they are not a competitor to our ministry. They are a part of our ministry. And so one of the best things that we can model to our churches is the fact that we take the time to actually be one. We take the time to have good, healthy marriages that are building us up, encouraging us, blessing us, and et cetera. And rather than seeing it something that takes time away from ministry, we actually see it that it's a part of ministry, because it really should be so. And I don't know how to put it into terms, but I think the nature of our relationship has actually been one of the factors that God's used to grow Hope Chapel from just a handful of people to being a church now that has a couple hundred families in its orbit and runs over 400. And because part of it is, I hear from people, especially from men, to say, it's interesting. They'll say, it's interesting. It's, I like coming here because you you come across as normal is what they say, and but I think they see that in marriage, in our marriage as well, that it comes across as something that's good.
Well,
Go ahead. Go ahead.
on the flip side of that, when we're not trying to also cultivate disciples and followers of Christ who have this relationship with God as an obligation, as a guilt driven, as a uh, and likewise, we to have a mutually respectful and submitting relationship where it's not out of because you're serving me and loving me, it's stirring me to love you back and not out of obligation or feeling like something I have to, but rather a joy. And so that's
Or
yeah,
another way to look at
similar.
it, another way to look at it is, I mean, as pastors, we think we're under shepherds, we're shepherds of the flock. So we're, if let me use this word, servant lovers towards the people in our church in the best sense. Well,
That's kind of weird.
but
No,
doing that,
yeah, like
but we serve them out of
you
love.
do.
Well,
Yeah,
great place to learn that is at home.
yeah.
And as we learn
Nothing
how to
wrong with
be
that.
serve out of love in our homes, to be servant lovers,
Not
it
out of
it carries
resentment
over
or
into lots of other
obligation.
things.
Yeah.
You know, and so
Well,
Robbie,
let me just interrupt 1 second.
fire away.
Sort of a passage that's kind of the theme for the pastor's heart is Psalm 78:72, and it refers, speaking of David, and David shepherded the people with integrity of heart and skillful hands he led them. So the
Mhm.
integrity of the heart isn't just when you're in the pastor role at church.
Right.
Yeah.
And part of what we're talking about in terms of this whole the pastor's heart, which is why the whole marriage dynamic is a crucial part of this.
Yeah. Yep.
The integrity in your relationship, whether you're in the role of pastor, worship leader, or at home.
So and so close it, isn't it just like God, right? That that one of the best things that we can give to our ministries is a great, healthy, flourishing marriage, but it's also a tremendous gift and blessing to us, right? And so it's just like God to say, here's this tool that you can use for me to create fruit, but at the same time, that tool is a tremendous blessing to us. So we get to be blessed to be a blessing. And so if we embrace that blessing of being one, of having thriving relationships, of really doing that stuff, it just ripples along. And that's something we talk about with our church all the time. Abraham was blessed to be a blessing, right? God blessed him to flow through to bless the nations, and we need to let that happen in our marriages. And so our marriages are not an obstacle to, they are designed to be a part of the conduit that God pours those blessings
Hopefully
into
not a
us.
casualty. And really we can't I know this goes without saying, but I just feel we can't discount God's grace in
Yeah.
this. And we've not done this perfectly, obviously, and there have been big bumps and little bumps in the road, but and just like as you're saved by grace and you continue to live by grace. And one of my verses that I just cling on to is Philippians 2:13, that it is God who is working in you to will and to want to do his good pleasure. And because I don't oftentimes don't want to love you, like out of my I
Really?
need I do, but I Lord Lord help my unbelief. Lord help my lack of,
I can't, I
my
can't, I can't believe anybody
so
wouldn't want to love me.
so
So
yeah, because we're by nature selfish, and isn't that really the essence of the gospel is two unloving people, coming toward each other in grace and deference and submission, and that's just a picture of what Christ has done for us and
And that gospel
wanted to move
picture
toward us.
that you're describing, one way we see that throughout the New Testament are the one another's.
yeah,
Encourage one another, forgive one another. And it's not if you forgive me, I'll forgive you.
yeah,
But
It's
as
not
you say,
transactional.
Neal, you get to take the initiative.
yeah.
But the truth is, the initiative, we should both be moving towards each other at the same time. There's a reciprocity. And I think that's modeled. And I think as a husband, to love my wife as Christ loved the church,
Yeah.
mutual submission the latter part of chapter 5.
Yeah,
I agree. I think that's that's a realistic perspective
yeah.
to keep
So
those. I keep them on my refrigerator. I have the one another's, the
yeah,
positive ones, and the few that are negative,
sure.
because
Love
that's
that.
living day to day. That eradicates some of the pebbles.
Yeah. So just, we've batted a lot of stuff around. There isn't any magic formula to having a great marriage, except for just really focusing on loving one another and trying to grow in that love, right? And there's
Sounds
not
so easy when you put it
well,
like
there's not
that,
there
but
isn't some kind of magical prayer we pray and it's just easy. There isn't any, book we can read or conference we can go to. There's no life scenario that just not, we have a great marriage kind of thing. It just, you have to work at it. And just like the scripture calls us to work out our salvation with fear and trembling, we need to work out our marriages with fear and trembling. They are a sacred gift. God's designed them to be a blessing to us,
In
that
a
we're
very unique relationship.
in this oneness with them, where our identity and our emotions and our finances and our futures and our family and everything is all wrapped up together. And when we work those things out with fear and trembling, that they're a blessing to us and they're a blessing to God's kingdom.
I think that's translated as humility too. And I just would like to really encourage two things to particularly ministry wives, but also their husbands, is please don't let it get so bad that you feel like that it's just irretrievable. There's no return. And please seek out the help. Reach out to a Christian sister. Reach out to someone in the denomination. Get personal counseling or help or something. If there's medication, let's just cast off the stigmas that go with that too. And then, actually, I forget what the second thing was I was going to say, but it was really good. It's just I think having high expectations really for what that ministry marriage can be just enjoyable, and you're getting a front row seat, first of all, not to sometimes people's train wrecks, but also to resurrections and miracles, and seeing people have victories, and it's really been great to do that together.
So we'll try to wrap this up one more time, right? So, Robby, in the sense of, your whole series is about not just surviving in ministry, it's about thriving in ministry. And for us to thrive in ministry, we need to have thriving marriages. And so we don't need to settle for just surviving together,
Yeah.
but we need to work on thriving. And so that when we wake up in the morning and roll over and look at the person who's on the other side of the bed, we're saying, man, I'm really great. I'm really grateful I'm doing life with them.
Yeah.
So anyways,
Yeah.
with that, I'll throw it back to you to wrap this up however you want to do that, sir.
Well, I want to say thank you to both you and Christina for taking the time and taking the time to talk through this and think through it, and okay, in the form of a conversation, which I think is so helpful. And the interplay, kind of me watching the interplay between you two as you're talking, and one of you gets a thought that you want to inject.
Mhm.
Uh, it's delightful. It's playful. It's healthy. So thank you so much. And I think the fact that God has allowed you to guys to push forward, to thrive, to keep the pebbles to a minimum, and allows you, I think it's in second, or it's one of the Corinthians, first or second.
Yeah,
Paul makes a statement about wherewith you've been comforted, comfort others.
yeah,
And our lives can be a story, a testimony. And I think that's true at Hope Chapel. It's more than just we're married and we also are here at the church, but it's integrated, it's woven together, and it's your story and it's his story.
yeah.
So thank you for sharing.
And what a
Thank
gift,
you.
right? That just like Paul said, hey, if you don't know how to follow Christ, then follow me because I'm following Christ, right? So, and if our marriages, we can simply say, you know what, if you want to know how to have a marriage as God intended it, just follow us. What a gift, right? And that's what, and it's a blessing to us, and it's a blessing that gets passed on. So thanks for hosting this, buddy.
Thank you so much.
Appreciate it.
Yeah.
Hopefully we didn't talk too much.
Again, for another conversation down the line.